let's talk a little bit about creating some basic geometry. We'll talk about the different types of geometry we can have, and we'll use some modeling tools in some practical scenarios. So to start, we need to get some geometry into our scene, and we can do that using something called primitives. Primitives are just basic shapes. Think about things like spheres, cylinders, and so forth. Now, there are two different kinds of primitives that we're going to be talking about here, polygons and NURBS. Let's go ahead and create a couple of primitives. We can create primitives from the shelf. You can see here under our poly modeling shelf, there are a lot of different shapes. We can go ahead and click the sphere, for instance, and it will create a sphere at the origin. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and move it off to the side by hitting the W key and then clicking on the red arrow and moving it on the x-axis. Now I'm going to go and create another kind of primitive. So we're going to go to create, and let's create, in this case, a NURBS primitive. You can see here the polygon primitives, but we're going to create a NURBS primitive, which is the second type of geometry we'll talk about. And let's create a sphere. All right, I'm just going to move this one off to the right. Primitives are a great starting point when you're building geometry. So what I usually do is I think about the different parts of my model. So maybe if I'm building an arm of a character, it's pretty cylindrical shape. So I might start with a cylinder and then modify that cylinder from there. You can also change the parameters of the cylinder. So for instance, if I click on this sphere, we can come over to the creation node in the inputs under the channel box, and we can click on this sphere node. And here you can see that there are subdivisions along the axis and the height and the radius of the sphere. We can input a number in here. We can also click on the name and use our middle mouse button to drag a value. We can also, when we go to create, come into the option box next to whatever primitive we plan on creating, and that will allow us to input those values before we create our object. We can do the same thing for the NURB sphere. Click on the creation node here, and then we can change our radius in the same way. So now that we've created some primitives, let's talk a little bit more in depth about the kind of geometry that we're working with. So right now we're in object mode, so each one of these is sort of treated the same. We can click on them and use the transform tools to move them around the scene, rotate them, and so forth. But their structure is fundamentally different. So this is a polygon object. Let's talk about what that means. Polygons are made of three different components. The first component is a vertex or a point. If we right click on our model, we can choose vertex and we can select individual points. Now these points are really just positions in 3D space, an X value, a Y value, and a Z value in space. So three numbers make up a point. There's no mass to the point. You can't see the point. We're getting a little dot here to indicate where it is so that we can manipulate it, but really it has no size to it. The next kind of component is an edge. Edges are straight lines, completely straight lines that connect two of those points in space. So again, there's no real size to an edge. It's really just a straight line between 2 points in space. The third kind of component is called a face, or sometimes it'll just be called a polygon. And that's the actual visible part of the model that we can see. In this case, you can see we can select a polygon face right here. A polygon is just a flat surface that we can actually see that's created by at least 3 edges. So here you can see this one has 4 edges. But if we move to the top, you can see here we do have some triangles at the top. This is the smallest kind of polygon that we can have in terms of number of edges. You can have polygons that have more than 4 edges. Those are called n-gons, where n is any number over 4. So in component mode, we can choose to select points and we can move those points, and you can see that changes the surface. We could also do the same for edges. I'm just using the shift key to add to my selection of edges, and then we can move those around. And you can also select faces and transform those. So your transform tools will work on any selection of components that you have. Let's move over quickly and talk about our NURBS components, because NURBS do have components, but they're slightly different. If we select our NURBS object and we right click on that, we're not going to see vertex, edge, and face. We're going to see control vertex, we're going to see isoparm, and we're going to see hull. And these work slightly different. If you click on control vertex, which is kind of similar to the polygon vertex, you can see that they're not actually on the surface. This surface is created with tangents and math so that as you grab one of these points, you can see we're changing the curvature between those other points. There are no edges per se to manipulate, but what we can do is manipulate a hole, which is basically just a row of control vertices. So if we click on this hole, for instance, we can select all of those CVs at once. We can then manipulate them here. One of the biggest differences between NURBS and polygons is that polygons can be any sort of shape. So you can make a shell that is extruded and has any sort of shape, whereas a NURBS object is flat patches that are combined in different ways. So for instance, this sphere is a flat piece of geometry, a flat square, that has been wrapped around on itself like a newspaper and then squeezed at the ends. You can create lots of different configurations with NURBS. It's good for things like pipes and tubes, but for the most part, you're probably going to be sticking with polygon geometry. But I do want you to be aware of what NURBS are, and they are really good for certain cases.